Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancée and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancée poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around, maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words. Help! I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again, closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancée was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancée grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancé had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancé climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, Nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled. Couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood. Never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I had been hiking alone for years, always careful, always prepared. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take unnecessary risks. But none of that mattered when I found myself stranded, miles from the nearest road with no clear way back. I had planned a 2-day trip through a national forest, a loop trail that climbed a ridge, offering a long stretch of exposed rock before descending back into dense pine forest. The route was well documented, moderate in difficulty, and heavily used in summer. But I had come in the early fall, just after the peak season, when the air was crisp and the crowds were gone. I parked at the trailhead before sunrise, checked my gear, and started up the path. The first few miles were easy, wide dirt trails, gradual incline, the sound of distant birds in the trees. I fell into my usual hiking rhythm, my boots pressing into damp soil, the weight of my pack settling comfortably on my shoulders. The trail climbed steadily, the trees thinning as I gained elevation. After about 4 hours, I reached the ridge, a long, narrow stretch of exposed rock, sloping gently upward. I took a break, sitting on a boulder, drinking from my water bottle. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold stone. I looked ahead. The trail followed the ridge for another few miles before dropping into a valley, where I planned to camp for the night. I kept walking. The path was easy to follow at first, marked by small cairns, stacks of rocks left by other hikers. But as I moved further along the ridge, the markers became less frequent. I didn't think much of it at the time. The terrain was open with good visibility, and I could see where the trail should be leading. Then the wind shifted. A low, heavy gust swept across the ridge, colder than before. The sky had darkened. Not storm clouds, but a dull, flat gray. I stopped, checking my map. The terrain didn't match what I expected. The ridge seemed narrower than it should have been, the drop-off steeper. I turned back the way I came, and nothing looked familiar. The cairns were gone. The boulders I had passed earlier weren't there. It was just open rock, sloping downward on both sides, with no clear path. My pulse picked up. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had a compass. I had my map. I had daylight. I moved carefully, picking my way back toward where I thought I had come from. But the terrain kept shifting. Small ridges and dips that hadn't been there before. I checked my map again, trying to orient myself. If I kept heading west, I would eventually hit the tree line, and from there I could find the trail again. I walked for over an hour. The trees never came. The landscape stretched endlessly in front of me. Barren rock, empty ridges. My legs ached from the uneven ground. My throat was dry, despite my water. Then I saw something ahead. At first, I thought it was another cairn, a small stack of stones, slightly off balance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cairn at all. It was a pile of bones, not animal bones. My stomach clenched. I knelt, staring at them. The bones were old, yellowed, weathered by wind and rain. Some had been cracked as if by pressure. They were arranged in a rough circle, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I stood up, my breath coming fast. I turned, and I saw more, scattered across the rock in irregular intervals, small piles of bones, some barely visible under thin layers of dirt.
A femur, a shattered skull, a ribcage collapsed inward.
I backed away, my pulse hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just someone who had gotten lost. This was something else. I turned sharply and kept moving. The wind had died completely. The air felt thick, heavy. My own footsteps sounded wrong against the rock. Too loud, too sharp. I needed to get off this ridge. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself not to run. I moved downhill, hoping to find a slope that would lead me back to the trees. But the ground kept tilting in ways that didn't make sense. Angles that felt wrong, dips that should have been climbs. Then I saw the cave. A narrow opening, barely visible in the rock face, partially hidden by a ledge. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed not to go near it. But I needed shelter. I needed a place to stop, to think. I stepped inside. The air was colder, damp. The space wasn't deep, just a small hollow in the rock, barely tall enough for me to stand. But the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, uneven gouges, overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. I stepped closer, running my fingers over them. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a frantic repetition of shapes. Tallies, hundreds of them carved deep into the stone. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. I turned to leave, and outside the cave, less than 50 feet away, something moved. It was low to the ground, barely more than a shadow against the rock. Crawling, moving with deliberate, jerky motions. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I scrambled down the ridge, slipping on loose stone, my pack throwing me off balance. My knees hit the ground hard, pain jolting up my legs. I pushed forward, breath burning in my chest. The landscape blurred, rocks, dips, uneven ground. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then trees. The moment I saw them, I sprinted. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms. My boots slammed into soft dirt. I kept going, running until my lungs felt like they would split. Then I collapsed. I lay there, gasping, my body shaking. The forest was silent, normal. I pulled out my map, my compass. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold them. But I wasn't lost anymore. I could find my way back. I walked for hours, refusing to stop. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I threw my pack inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I never reported what I found. I never told anyone about the bones, the scratches, the thing I saw, because I knew no one would believe me, and because I knew, somewhere out there, in the empty stretches of rock, in the places where the trail disappears, there are things you aren't supposed to find. And once you do, they don't let you go. I don't know why I went back. I had hiked those woods before, years ago, back when I was younger and didn't know better. It was the kind of place that stayed with you, though, the kind that crept into your bones long after you left. The thick forests, the endless silence, the way the trees pressed in, heavy and watchful. It wasn't a friendly place. I had told myself I wouldn't return, but time dulls things. The older I got, the more I convinced myself that I had overreacted, that I had imagined things. So when an old buddy mentioned the cabin was still standing, deep in the woods, barely used anymore, I found myself considering it. A week alone in the mountains, away from everything. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. It didn't sound so bad. The hike in was harder than I remembered. The trail had mostly disappeared, swallowed by the undergrowth, and I had to fight through brush and deadfall to make progress. The cabin sat nearly 20 miles from the nearest road, far enough that no one just stumbled upon it. I had packed light food, water, sleeping bag, a small hatchet, and my rifle. I didn't plan to hunt, but I wasn't stupid enough to come out here unarmed. The woods had predators, both the four-legged and two-legged kind. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping low, turning the sky that deep orange that never lasts long enough. The cabin looked almost exactly as I remembered. Weathered logs, sagging roof, a small porch with a single chair. The lock on the door was rusted, but the key still fit. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust. The furniture was simple. An old table, a wooden chair, a narrow cot against the wall. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, blackened with years of use. A few shelves held ancient canned goods that I wouldn't be touching. It was exactly as I had left it. But as I stood there, taking it all in, that feeling crept back. The one I had forgotten, that heavy, watching silence. I shook it off. First night nerves, nothing more. The first couple of days passed quietly. I spent the daylight hours hiking the nearby trails, collecting firewood, filtering water from the small creek that ran behind the cabin. The solitude felt good, peaceful even. At night, though, the feeling returned. That sense that something wasn't right started small. On the third morning, I noticed something odd. My gear had been moved. My rifle, which I always kept propped against the cot, was leaning against the wall by the door. My pack was half-zipped, though I knew I had closed it. I tried to explain it away. Maybe I had been careless. Maybe I had moved things and forgotten. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I locked the door. The fourth night, I woke up to a sound. A slow, deliberate creak of wood. I lay still, barely breathing. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Another creak. The porch. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, maybe a stray hunter. But no animal would step that carefully. The sound stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I checked the clearing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, leading up to the porch, were footprints. Barefoot, human. The tracks circled the cabin, moving toward the door, then back into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone out here. I considered leaving, but I had hiked nearly 20 miles to get here. Another day's walk just to reach my truck. I told myself it was nothing. A lost hiker, maybe, someone passing through. I would stay one more night. That evening, I built a fire outside, keeping my rifle close. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I ate quickly, my eyes scanning the treeline. As the sky darkened, I locked the cabin door and braced a chair under the handle, just in case. I lay down, but I didn't sleep. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A soft shuffle of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, my fingers tight around the rifle. The footsteps moved to the window. A shadow passed over the thin curtain. My chest clenched. I forced myself to stay still, to wait. Then the doorknob rattled. Not violently, just testing. I raised the rifle, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rattling stopped. A long silence. Then soft footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag, my rifle slung over my shoulder. When I stepped outside, the forest was still. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy. The footprints were back, fresh. They led from the trees to the cabin. But this time, they didn't leave. I scanned the area, my stomach twisting. Whoever had been watching me was still out here. I didn't wait. I moved fast, taking the narrow trail toward my truck. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. By midday, I was making good time. The sun was high, and I started to feel the first real relief in days. Then I saw it. Ahead, just off the trail, something was hanging from a tree. A deer carcass, but not just hanging. It had been tied there, its legs bound with vines, its throat slit clean, and beneath it on the ground a single object. A boot, an old, rotting hiking boot. I turned and walked faster. The rest of the hike was a blur, pushing through the underbrush, barely stopping to rest. By the time I reached my truck, the sky was turning orange. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. But before I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood at the tree line, far enough to be blurry, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. Small, barefoot, watching. I didn't wait. I turned the key, slammed the truck into gear, and tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not looking back. I never told anyone what happened. I don't know who or what I saw in those woods. I just know that I won't be going back. I had been hiking alone for years. It was something I always enjoyed. Just me, my pack, and the wilderness. I never felt the need to bring anyone along. I liked the quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being completely self-reliant. This trip was no different. I had taken time off work and planned a 3-day solo hike through a stretch of national forest I had never explored before. It wasn't a well-known trail, which was part of the appeal. Fewer people meant fewer distractions. I arrived at the trailhead around noon. The parking lot was empty, which didn't surprise me. It was midweek, and this wasn't exactly a popular hiking spot. I strapped on my pack, checked my gear, and set off. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding through thick trees and overgrown brush. I made good time, stopping only to drink water or adjust my pack. The deeper I went, the more the modern world faded away. That was what I wanted. By late afternoon, I had covered about 10 miles. I found a decent clearing near a small creek and decided to set up camp. The air was cool, the sound of running water calming. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. It was the kind of night I had experienced countless times before. But something about this place felt different. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of the creek and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I tried to brush it off as my imagination. I was deep in the woods. Sometimes things just felt off. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I drifted off, I would wake up suddenly, heart pounding, for no reason. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual unease that came with being alone in the wilderness. But something didn't feel right. The next morning, I packed up and continued on. The trail got rougher the further I went. Overgrown branches, uneven ground, steep inclines. I moved slower, more carefully. I didn't see any signs of other hikers, no footprints, no trash, nothing. That should have made me feel good. It meant I had the place to myself. But instead, it made me uneasy. By mid-afternoon, I started noticing strange things. At first, it was little details, small things that seemed out of place. A tree with deep scratches in the bark, like something had clawed at it. A pile of rocks stacked in a way that didn't seem natural. A half-buried, rusted canteen that looked like it had been there for years. Then I found something worse. A campsite, or at least what was left of one. It was old, probably months, maybe even years abandoned. The tent was collapsed, torn open along one side. The fire pit was filled with ash and partially burned logs. Scattered around the site were items that didn't belong in the woods. A single running shoe, a faded backpack with the straps cut off, a broken flashlight with no batteries. There was no sign of the person who had left it all behind. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. There were no signs of an animal attack. No blood, no fur, no torn clothing. It didn't look like someone had packed up and left, either. It was like they had just vanished. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I kept moving. The deeper I went, the worse it got. More strange things. More trees with deep scratches. More odd rock piles. A rusted-out hunting knife stabbed into the trunk of a tree, the handle wrapped in duct tape. Then, about an hour before sunset, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Fresh ones. Not mine. They were on the trail, leading in the same direction I was going. Barefoot. The size of an adult man's foot. The sight of them made my blood run cold. I wasn't alone. I stopped, listening, scanning the trees. The woods were silent. I couldn't hear anything. No footsteps. No movement. But I knew someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I didn't want to camp out here. Not after what I had seen. I decided to turn back, hike until nightfall, then find a safer spot to stop. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up. My body tensed with every step. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see someone standing there. Then, as the sun dipped low and the trees cast long shadows over the trail, I saw something up ahead. A figure, standing in the trees, just off the path. I froze. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. He was tall, thin, dirty. He wasn't wearing a shirt. His skin was covered in something dark, mud or maybe dried blood. His eyes were locked on me. He didn't move. I didn't move. We stood there, staring at each other. Then he took a step forward. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the trail, not looking back, not slowing down. My pack slammed against my back. Branches scraped my arms and face. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know if he was following me. I didn't want to find out. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until I couldn't run anymore. Then I stopped, collapsed against a tree, and listened. Silence.
No footsteps.
No rustling leaves. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I found a small clearing and sat with my back against a tree, my knife clutched in my hand. Every noise made my heart pound. Every shadow looked like a figure standing in the darkness. The first light, I was moving again. I hiked fast, barely stopping to rest. My only goal was getting back to my car. The whole way, I felt that same sensation, that creeping, gut-wrenching feeling of being watched. But I never saw him again. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was high in the sky. My car was right where I left it, untouched. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors. Then I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I started the engine and drove away. I don't know who that man was. I don't know how long he had been out there or what he wanted, but I never went back. Hiking has always been my escape. I don't like crowded trails or national parks packed with tourists. I prefer the quiet, the solitude, the places where you can go miles without seeing another person. There's something peaceful about being alone out there. Just me, my pack, and the sound of my boots on the dirt. That's why I picked this trail. It was deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. Not an official trail, not something you'd find in a guidebook. I found it on an old map, a thin, winding path that cut through dense forest and climbed up into the hills. It looked perfect, remote, untouched, exactly what I was looking for. I packed light, just the essentials. A small tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water for a couple of days. My plan was simple: hike up, camp for a night, hike back down. Nothing complicated. The trail started off easy, a narrow dirt path cutting through tall trees. The air smelled fresh, that mix of pine and damp earth. The sun filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. It was quiet, peaceful. I hiked for hours, climbing higher into the hills, the trail getting rougher, less defined. The further I went, the less it looked like anyone had been through recently. The ground was covered in leaves, the trail barely visible in places. A few times I had to stop and check my map, making sure I was still going the right way. Around midday, I took a break on a flat stretch of rock overlooking the valley. The view was incredible, rolling hills covered in dense forest, stretching out for miles. Not a single sign of civilization. Exactly what I wanted. After eating a quick meal, I got moving again. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, half covered by leaves, but definitely there. Fresh. Not mine. Someone else had been here. I stopped, scanning the trail ahead. I hadn't seen another person all day. Hadn't heard anything. No voices. No distant sounds of movement. The footprints were the only sign. I told myself it was nothing. Probably an old set, someone who had passed through a day or two ago. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I kept moving, picking up my pace. The trail wound deeper into the trees, the terrain getting rougher. I had to climb over fallen logs, push through patches of thick brush. The whole time, I kept thinking about those footprints. A few miles later, I found something else. A campsite. It wasn't much. Just a small clearing, an old fire pit, some flattened grass where a tent had been. But something about it felt off. There was no gear, no sign of anyone actually camping there. Just the remains of a fire, burned down to ashes. I crouched down, brushing my fingers over the coals. Still warm. Someone had been here. Recently. I stood up, scanning the trees. The sun was getting lower now, the shadows stretching longer. The forest felt different. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had just stumbled onto an old campsite. But my gut told me to keep moving. I hiked faster, putting distance between me and that clearing. The trees grew thicker, the trail harder to follow. I kept going until I found a decent spot to set up camp. A small clearing next to a rocky outcrop. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a small fire, ate a quick meal, and settled in for the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no sounds of small animals moving in the brush. Just silence. I sat by the fire, staring into the trees, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I told myself it was all in my head, just nerves. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, but then I heard it. A sound, faint, coming from the trees. A twig snapping. I froze. My eyes scanned the darkness, looking for movement. Nothing, just shadows. Another sound, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was out there. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The fire crackled softly beside me, casting flickering light across the trees. Then silence. Whoever was out there had stopped moving. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, waiting. But the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. Just the forest doing what it does. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. The uneasy feeling from the night before hadn't gone away. If anything, it was worse. I hiked fast, moving down the trail at a steady pace. The sooner I got out of those woods, the better. But then, about a mile down the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another set of footprints. Not mine, not old, fresh, and they were following mine. Whoever was out there had been following me, watching me. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't wait. I didn't stop. I just moved. I hiked faster than I ever had in my life, practically jogging down the trail. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like someone lurking just out of sight. I didn't stop until I saw my car. I threw my pack inside, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. But I never hiked that trail again. I've camped alone more times than I can count. Some people think it's reckless, but I've always found peace in the solitude. There's something about being deep in the woods, miles from anyone else, that makes the world feel simpler.
No emails.
No traffic. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had planned for 3 nights out in the wilderness, far from any official campsites. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from trails, near a small creek. It was a perfect place. Plenty of firewood, fresh water, and total isolation. The first day went smoothly. I parked my truck on an old dirt road, hiked about 5 miles into the woods, and found a clearing big enough for my tent. The trees were thick on all sides, but there was just enough space for a fire pit and a decent view of the creek. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked some simple food over the fire as the sun set. The air was cool, the smell of pine and damp earth strong. As darkness settled in, I sat by the fire, letting the warmth soak in. Nights in the woods can be unnerving if you aren't used to them. The silence isn't really silence. It's filled with distant rustling, the occasional snap of a branch, the wind moving through the trees. I've learned to tune it out. Most noises are just animals going about their business. That first night, I slept deeply, the steady sounds of the creek lulling me into unconsciousness. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring, hiking further upstream, fishing a little. The sun filtered through the trees. The scent of damp leaves filled the air, and I felt completely at peace. But as the sun started to dip, something felt different. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. The woods were quieter than before. The usual evening sounds, chirping insects, rustling branches, felt more distant, like they were further away than they should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. That night, as I sat by the fire, I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing was there. I forced myself to relax, but my body wouldn't listen. The hairs on my arms stood up. My stomach felt tight. My instincts were screaming at me, but I had no reason to feel that way. I stayed up later than usual, adding more wood to the fire, keeping it burning longer than I normally would. I told myself it was just a precaution, maybe a subconscious habit from too many nights alone in the wild. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was silent, too silent. I listened, barely breathing. No wind,
No insects.
no running water from the creek. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Leaves crunching, slow, careful, not an animal. Someone was walking outside my tent. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps were light, measured, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife I always kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped, right next to me. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. No movement.
No retreating footsteps.
Just silence. I lay there, barely blinking, every muscle locked in place. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Felt like hours. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, light was seeping through the fabric of my tent. Morning. I sat up slowly, my entire body stiff. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had just been my mind playing tricks. Then, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints, circled my tent. They weren't mine. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They came from the trees, moved around my tent, and then nothing. No footprints leading away, like whoever it was had just vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my pulse spike. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, I don't know who or what was out there. I never saw them, never heard them leave. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. No one really goes up that way, he had said. Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. Felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, Then, just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none, just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty. But I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, and I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing. I was running a long haul from Montana down to Texas, a good-paying load of steel beams headed for a construction site outside of Dallas. The trip was mostly open highway, cutting through Wyoming, Colorado, and into New Mexico before hitting the long stretch of Texas roads. I had done this route before, knew most of the truck stops along the way, knew which places had the best fuel prices, which rest areas were decent, and which ones to avoid. It was a straight run, nothing complicated. The truck was handling well, my trailer was balanced, and the weight was sitting right on the axles. My only concern was making good time so I could get ahead of a storm system I had been hearing about on the radio. Big rain coming out of the northwest, moving fast, threatening to dump water all the way down into New Mexico. I didn't want to be stuck hauling heavy steel on wet roads, so I planned to push through as far as I could before stopping for the night. I had left early that morning, fueled up outside of Billings, and made it past Cheyenne before sunset. The air was cooling down, the roads mostly empty except for a few other truckers running their own routes. It was one of those stretches of highway where you could drive for hours without seeing much of anything. Just road, dry grass, and the occasional gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated in 30 years. Around 9 at night, I passed a small roadside motel with a diner attached to it. I thought about stopping, maybe grabbing a coffee, but I wasn't tired yet. I figured I'd keep going, maybe make it into Colorado before taking a break. I had plenty of fuel, my logbook was clean, and I was making good time. That was when I saw the first sign. It was one of those old-fashioned wooden signs, half-rotted, sitting just off the highway. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. My headlights caught the faded lettering as I rolled past. I didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of old rest stops along these highways, some maintained, some not. I had used them before when I needed a quick stretch, though I preferred truck stops with other rigs around. Safer that way. But 2 miles wasn't far, and I was starting to feel that ache in my back from sitting too long. I figured I'd pull in, stretch my legs, maybe use the bathroom if it was clean enough. A few minutes later, I saw the turnoff. A narrow road, barely wide enough for a big rig, leading off the highway into the darkness. The sign was old, rusted, barely standing, but the words were still visible. I signaled, eased onto the exit, and followed the road. The pavement turned to gravel almost immediately. My tires crunched over the loose stone as I rolled forward, my headlights cutting through the darkness. There were no lights, no other vehicles, just trees on either side closing in tight. I slowed down. The place should have had at least some lighting. Even the worst rest stops usually had a few old street lamps, maybe a vending machine glowing in the dark. But this place was dead quiet. I kept going. Then I saw it. A small parking lot, cracked pavement, weeds pushing up through the cracks. An old brick building sat at the far end, the kind of structure that might have been nice 40 years ago but had been left to rot. A few picnic tables sat off to the side, their wood warped and splintered. No lights, no cars. I pulled into the lot, letting my rig roll to a stop. I kept the engine running. Something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it the second I stopped moving. The way the air felt too still, the way the trees seemed to press in closer than they should. I glanced around, checking my mirrors. Nothing, just empty space, darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I was about to put the truck back in gear, forget about stretching, and get back on the highway. Then I noticed something. The bathroom door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. Just enough to see the dark space inside. It hadn't been open when I pulled in. I stared at it for a second, my hands tightening on the wheel. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it had been open the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I had a feeling, deep in my gut, that I wasn't alone. I put my truck in gear. That was when I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the gravel. But they were there, leading from the bathroom to where I had stopped. Not away, toward. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I hit the gas, my tires kicking up dust as I swung the rig around and aimed for the road. The gravel slid under my tires, the trailer rocking slightly as I forced the truck back onto the exit ramp. I checked my mirrors one last time. The bathroom door was closed. I never saw it move. I never stopped at a rest stop like that again. I was hauling a load of lumber out of Oregon, headed for a distribution yard in Nebraska. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, just interstate driving, a couple of planned fuel stops, and maybe a quick nap at a rest area if I needed it. I had been driving long haul for over a decade by then, so nothing about this trip felt unusual. I left the yard around noon, got through the mountain roads without issue, and hit the open highways by early evening. The truck was running smooth, my load was sitting right, and I had a good stretch of road ahead of me. I figured I'd push through until at least midnight before pulling over for some rest. The first part of the drive was peaceful. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road, but the skies were clear. Traffic was light, just a few other truckers rolling along, the occasional car passing by. I had the radio on low, sipping from a cup of coffee I had grabbed at my last stop. I was somewhere in Idaho when I saw the car. It was just sitting there on the side of the road, barely visible in the fading light. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about it seemed off. It wasn't just broken down. It looked abandoned. The hood was up, but there were no hazard lights, no signs of movement. I glanced at it as I passed. The driver's side door was open. No one was inside. I kept driving. Things like that happen all the time. Someone breaks down. Maybe they walk to get help. Maybe they get picked up by another driver. But something about it unsettled me. About 20 miles later, I saw another one. Same make, same model, same open door. That was when my gut started telling me something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I had driven all over the country, seen my fair share of weird things, but two abandoned cars, same type, same situation, just miles apart, that didn't sit right. I kept my speed steady, watching my mirrors, scanning the road ahead. Maybe it was some kind of coincidence, or maybe there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. Then I saw the third one. This time it was in the middle of the highway. I hit the brakes hard, my tires screeching against the pavement. My trailer groaned under the sudden stop, the weight shifting behind me, but I kept control. The car sat there, no lights, no movement. My headlights washed over it, and that's when I noticed something else. The windshield was covered in something dark. thick streaks like someone had smeared mud or grease across the glass. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I wasn't about to get out and check. I eased my truck to the shoulder, keeping my eyes on the mirrors. The desert stretched out on either side, nothing but open land, but something about it felt wrong. Like I wasn't alone. I took a breath, shifted into reverse, and started backing up. My trailer swung slightly as I maneuvered, my eyes flicking between my mirrors and the road ahead. Once I had enough space, I cut the wheel hard and pulled back onto the highway, rolling past the abandoned car as I picked up speed. I didn't look inside, didn't want to know. The road ahead was empty. The road behind me stayed dark. I kept driving. Maybe an hour passed. I had put enough distance between me and that stretch of highway that I started to feel a little better. The night air had cooled, my rig was running smooth, and I was getting close to the state line. Then I saw the headlights. Far behind me, just two tiny pinpricks of light at first. But they were moving fast. Too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching in my mirrors as the lights gained on me. My pulse picked up, my hands tightening on the wheel. It was a car, dark-colored, same make, same model. I exhaled slow, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some guy in a hurry, flying down the highway. But I knew better. The car got closer, close enough that I could see it was the same as the ones I had passed earlier. Same shape, same dark paint, moving fast but staying just behind me. Then the headlights cut out, just gone. My breath caught in my throat. I checked my mirrors. Nothing but darkness. I kept driving. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what was happening, didn't know what I had gotten myself into, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't stopping. Another hour passed. I kept my rig steady, rolling through the night, waiting for something else to happen. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had outrun whatever this was, I saw the taillights, not far ahead, sitting in the middle of the road. A car, dark-colored, facing the wrong way. I didn't slow down, didn't stop. I gritted my teeth, checked my mirrors one last time, and kept going. The car loomed closer, my headlights hitting it full force. The driver's side door was open, and this time there was someone standing next to it. A figure, just a dark shape in the glow of my high beams. I didn't see a face, didn't want to. I hit the gas. My truck roared past, my trailer rocking slightly from the air pressure, and then the car was behind me, swallowed up by the night. I didn't stop until I hit the next truck stop, a well-lit place with plenty of other rigs parked around. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and sat there for a long time, breathing hard. Nothing on the news. No reports of abandoned cars. Just another quiet night on the highway. But I never took that route again.